When was the last time you stopped to think about the one thing you can't live without? No, I'm not talking about the internet. I'm talking about water. Without clean drinking water, life couldn't go on. So it's probably important that we know what's in the water we drink. For the past 65 years, city governments nationwide have been adding a substance called fluoride to the water supply. The practice of water fluoridation started at a time in history when asbestos, PCBs, and DDT were all deemed safe and effective. And although all of these chemicals have been banned since, fluoridation is still a common practice. However, it's uniquely American. The U.S. has more people drinking fluoridated water than the rest of the world combined. In fact, most industrialized nations do not fluoridate their water, including Japan and 97% of Europe. So what exactly is it that we're ingesting? Well, it's not the same fluoride that's in your toothpaste. What's being added to municipal water supplies is a fluorine compound called HYDROFLUOSILICIC acid, and it's a byproduct from the phosphate fertilizer industry. Yes, you heard me right. Let me break this down for you. Gaseous fluoride is produced during fertilizer production. Now, it used to go straight into the atmosphere from these factories, but presently, filtration devices are used to contain the toxic chemicals, and what's extracted from the filters is then condensed into a water-based solution, which is packaged unrefined and sold to city governments for the purpose of water fluoridation. So how did this all start? Well, interestingly, in 1944, the American Dental Association themselves published that it was not worth the health risk to fluoridate water supplies. Too bad no one heeded their warning, because the very next year, Grand Rapids, Michigan became the first community to fluoridate. And what happened next would not have been possible without a push from the aluminum industry, which was looking for a way to safely discard their fluoride pollution and waste. In 1947, Oscar Ewing, a paid attorney for Alcoa, the biggest aluminum company in the U.S., was picked to oversee the Public Health Service, which is now known as the Department of Health and Human Services. He then made clear his lingering ties to the aluminum industry by promoting water fluoridation as one of the first official policies of the department. From there, the policy expanded tenfold, with an additional 87 U.S. cities fluoridating within the next 3 years. Fast forward to today, where children are growing up indoctrinated with the notion that fluoridated water is necessary because it prevents tooth decay. But is that really the case? In 1987, the National Institute of Dental Research examined 39,000 school children from 84 different fluoridated and non-fluoridated communities. And while the study did find that in fluoridated areas tooth decay declined, the most interesting part is that there was a declining trend in tooth decay in non-fluoridated areas too, perhaps because of overall better hygiene. Okay, but not only is there no causal link, there's also serious health risks for fluoride overexposure. For one, an excess of fluoride causes fluorosis, which is the eating away of the enamel on your teeth. This is indicative of what it's doing to your body on a larger scale. You see, it doesn't just eat away at the tooth enamel. Only 50% of the fluoride we consume is excreted. The rest is absorbed throughout our bodies, our pineal glands, and our bones. In fact, an alarming study by the U.S. Public Health Service, which was later confirmed by Harvard Medical School, found that a deadly type of bone cancer called osteosarcoma was significantly higher in fluoridated communities than in non-fluoridated communities. However, the most distressing findings come from 18 studies done worldwide, showing a substantial lowering of IQ in overly fluoridated areas. And there are many more adverse effects than just those. Not to mention that the FDA admits that fluoride is a drug, not a nutrient. Multiple ethical codes are being violated here by forcing us to ingest this drug. Look, let's call it like it is. Water fluoridation has nothing to do with said benefits. Think about it. We're already getting our fair share of this substance through the dentist and the toothpaste we use every day. And what about the processed foods we're already eating and drinking on a daily basis? We get more than enough. So the argument that we need to ingest this substance as well is baseless. Look, guys, no matter what you think about fluoride, the real issue here is having a choice. No chemical, no matter what its alleged benefits are, should be forced upon the public without their consent. But let's not forget, as long as corporations are involved, our best interest isn't really the priority. So maybe we should be looking at water fluoridation as a money-making scam. It's a tale that's all too familiar. Governments and industry colluding to save money instead of saving lives.
All right, I think we're live. Welcome to A Growing Concern. I have my guest, Scott Fernandez, who is a Portland microbiologist, and he's been involved with water issues here in Portland for quite some time, actually since as long as I've known him, which has been a few years. There's been an ongoing attempt by the city commissioners to cover up the reservoirs, and that was his big fight for a while, and then we got into the fluoride fight as well. And if we can get the technology lined up, Scott's brought a PowerPoint presentation. We're working on that. Been working on that for quite a while now. We hope to get that moving here in a few minutes, and we'll bring that online as soon as we get it hooked up. But Scott, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having me. This is a very important issue that we're dealing with. The city of Portland right now is at the crossroads of our public health as far as drinking water goes, and on a number of issues. The first part that we're going to be talking about tonight is the fluoride situation, a vote that will be coming up in May, and this is extremely important for the community to decide to vote no against this fluoride that they want to add to our drinking water, and we'll see why here in a few minutes. And also the second part will be involving the EPA regulation to force us to add drinking water treatment for the Bull Run watershed, which we don't need because there's never been a public health risk about that, and also to cover our reservoirs, which we also don't need to do because there's never been a public health risk involving those. So what we need to do as a community is unite to form the basis for not adding any more of these chemicals that they want us to put into our drinking water through the fluoridation and through the EPA regulation to force us to do that. So we have to be very diligent in getting this message to our city council and the rest of the elected officials. We do not want any added cost, and we do not want any added chemicals.
Well, it seems to me it's ridiculous because every time I get a water bill, it seems like it goes up. And here we have all this fresh water coming off that mountain, and our water is going up and up and up. Is that because of these whatever you'd want to call it, that they're doing, these processes that they're doing in the city water bureau?
Well, see, that's exactly right. And they've spent the last almost decade now messing around with a regulation that doesn't really apply to us because it applied to a situation in Milwaukee, Wisconsin that we'll see on the PowerPoint tonight 20 years ago this month. And over the last 20 years, nothing that they have proposed as being a public health benefit from this regulation has come true, not one thing. And yet we've spent in this city hundreds of millions of dollars to address a public health problem that doesn't exist, hasn't existed, and it never will exist here because we don't have sewage exposure in our Bull Run watershed, which is really, really important because the city of Portland has a unique situation in its Bull Run watershed, the best water in North America, if not the world. So that's what we have to keep in mind as we go forward.
Well, no, they always say follow the money. So if this isn't being done for fluoride and mainly the covering of the reservoirs, if this isn't being done in order to enhance the lives of the people, who's it being done for?
Well, this is it. The simple word is money. And this is not only dealing with fluoridation and the EPA LT2 regulation, but ultimately a document that was written in 2001 was called the Regional Transmission and Storage Strategy, which outlined by corporate engineers that they wanted to regionalize the drinking water systems for the Tri-County area of Clackamas, Multnomah, and Washington counties. So that's what this boils down to. This is the long-range plan, and they're following it like they said they would, and the fluoridation and the covering of the reservoirs and adding treatment is just part of the process that they're following. And it's the corporate engineers that are doing it and influencing the politicians.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've been fortunate to have the benefit of you on this program in the past. And you have mentioned that some of the folks, the engineers or the designers that are involved with the one in Portland, were also involved with similar circumstances up in Seattle, and it was a fiasco.
It was, and they had problems. They covered the reservoirs up there over the past few years, and they've had very bad construction problems that have cost them a lot of money also, that would allow because the workmanship was so poor that it allowed contaminants to get into the covered reservoirs. And tonight we'll go through the process of reviewing what the differences are public health-wise and cost-wise between the open and covered reservoirs. We definitely, in our situation, want to keep our open reservoirs. And we'll go into great detail about that later on.
Mm-hmm. Well, the folks are working on getting that PowerPoint worked up, and you've done PowerPoints before, and they've always been very clear and to the point. And one thing I want to ask you right off the bat, and I almost forgot, is you're a microbiologist, so
Right.
you know everybody knows what biology is. So microbiology would be honing in on the biology to the very small.
Right. We're talking about microorganisms like parasites and viruses and bacteria. And the EPA regulation was based on a single microorganism, one microorganism in a sewage event. And that microorganism was a parasite called Cryptosporidium. And Cryptosporidium are all over the place. They're on your dogs, cats, daycare centers, recreational centers, and water. They're all over the place. And EPA initially tried to say that this was confined only to drinking water, and it's far from that. It is all over in the environment, and we do not have a problem with it in a public health way from in our drinking water system.
So it's not like Giardia that just makes you totally. It's,
Right.
you know, you get up in the woods and you drink the wrong water, and you know you got to have multiple shots of powerful antibiotics to get rid of it. It's not something of that order.
No, and they've overemphasized the public health risk of it, and that's one of the things that we've seen, that EPA and CDC have already acknowledged that over the last 20 years there haven't been any surface utility water Cryptosporidium events. There again is none of what they said was going to come true. And during this 20-year period, not one event has happened, and there haven't been any deaths from Cryptosporidium like they said that would be coming every year. Not one death, and they haven't found disease within the communities of the United States from Cryptosporidium in surface drinking water.
And so they're actually it's a, how is it that people have a phrase for genetically engineered food? It's a solution in search of a problem.
Exactly, exactly. And this is it isn't amusing, but it has been ironic that they would take a sewage event that has hundreds of disease-causing microorganisms and trillions of them in a sewage event over a period of a month that it took place over in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and yet they only identified one microorganism as the cause of all this disease, and that's where they've been really, really wrong.
Well, it seems to me that there's a lot of the sky is falling. Wasn't there a recently, or not recently, but within the last few years, somebody had thrown an animal or something into one of them closed, dead animal into one of them closed reservoirs, or something happened up there and they were just going crazy about it? You remember something about that?
Well, yes, and
they're just using that to frighten people.
yes, and there's always, the open reservoirs in our situation pose no more risk than what we see in everyday life. The Water Bureau and the state take samples of the water routinely, thousands of samples throughout our distribution system over the year. And the distribution system around the reservoirs is showing very clean, very few bacteria, and they're the ones that are not disease-causing. There's never been a public health risk event from chemicals either in our open reservoirs in the 100-year history that we've had them. That can't be said about covered reservoirs. People have died from covered reservoir drinking water in Gideon, Missouri, and in Alamosa, Colorado, because birds like pigeons got into the covered reservoirs and roosted there for months at a time, eventually creating a situation where the people were dying from salmonella. And that just hasn't happened in our situation at all. It's very much different.
And also, I think I remember from a past program you mentioned that if they're uncovered, they're liable to breathe, and if they're covered up, stuff that is added to it, stuff meaning whatever those chemicals are, don't have a chance to breathe out, and they remain in the water.
That's exactly right, and that's one of the benefits of the open reservoirs, is that it's a natural ecosystem, where in the covered reservoirs it's a totally different ecosystem where there's no oxygen for the bacteria, there's no sunlight, there's no waits for gases that we don't want, like radon and chloroform, to vent out, where in the open reservoirs that we have, it's very easy for those gases to easily go into the atmosphere harmlessly and save us from having to inhale those gases that would be coming into our homes and when we're taking a shower or doing laundry or something like that. So we're very fortunate to have the open reservoirs and the Bull Run water system that we do.
And so, getting into the fluoride issue, they're going to actually intend to further adulterate it by adding a byproduct of the fertilizer industry in order to protect our children's teeth.
Right, and what isn't being told is that they also add byproducts from the aluminum industry and from the nuclear industry, and these come from around the world. We see stuff coming into this area that are being used in the Beaverton area for fluoridation that are coming in from China that have identified on the label arsenic and lead as being contaminants. And the National Sanitation Foundation is the organization that oversees the chemical summary of these sodium fluoride and hydrofluosilicic acid, which is a tongue twister.
I won't even attempt to say it.
I know, it's tough. But these things are highly contaminated with heavy metals, like I said, arsenic, lead, mercury, cadmium, chromium, all kinds of stuff that we just don't want in there. And there's no safe levels of those chemicals. We know that these chemicals are very toxic and can cause very significant long-term public health effects because these, over time, accumulate in our bodies, and especially the children, because they have different systems of biochemistry than an adult does. So they're, over a period of a lifetime, they do have negative effects from this stuff.
That reminds me of a note I made when I was watching that excellent roll-in video from the very beginning, and the gal, right or wrong, mentioned that 50% of the fluoride that we take is excreted, but 50% remains behind.
It's a little clipped, but that's about it. We can still run it.
Okay.
Okay, we've got 90% of our graphic presentation.
Yeah.
We'll give it a try here in a few seconds. We'll let you know here.
Just say next slide.
All right, and so are you familiar with that statistic that she mentioned, that some of this fluoride remains in the body that is not excreted like some of these?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think that's an important part I haven't heard yet.
Absolutely, and it gets into the bones and different organs and can cause real problems. The thyroid gland, the pineal gland, the brain, of course, the liver, all these
bones,
bones, all will get affected. What we see here is in the background is just a glimpse of the Bull Run. It is there we go. This is the greatest gift any city could ever get, and it's just pristine. There's no sewage from agriculture or industry or cities, municipal sewage. So this is the great gift. It eliminates all the chemicals that we don't want, like the Willamette has, and it eliminates the sewage that has all those nasty microorganisms. So all we do to treat our waters with chlorine and ammonia, and then that's it.
And the forest cleans it for us.
The forest does the job. Mother Nature's much smarter than we are. I just wanted to bring out the costs that will be involved too. These are the water rates that the Water Bureau has published over the last few years, and it shows a significant increase over time. And we just cannot continue to do this. As I said earlier, we spent hundreds of millions of dollars to build a Kelly Butte reservoir and a Powell Butte reservoir that we don't need, and that's just the beginning. Spent tens of millions of dollars to design an ultraviolet radiation plant that we don't need, and it just keeps on going. And next year there's a small increase, allegedly, of almost 8%, but the base charges will go up also. But people that are on fixed incomes and low incomes and businesses are negatively affected. All of those people are. Siltronic Industries just lost half of their workforce last September because of the water rates over the years. And so they let hundreds of people go. And it didn't stop there. Steinfeld Pickles left a few years ago because of the water rates. And we're going to see much more of that. When we talk about industries and businesses in this city, the chemicals that we're talking about are going to have a very, very negative effect on the microbrewery industries. They are very worried about these chemicals coming in. They have this pure, fresh, pristine water that what we're known for with our microbrews, and this is going to have a very harmful effect on them. It will be profound.
They'll have to distill the water on an industrial scale.
There's no way to really eliminate this stuff. Its filtering is very difficult. Distilling is very difficult. None of the treatments that the other side is saying that can be used, none of them are absolute, not one, whether it's reverse osmosis or anything like that.
And this is the costs of the fluoridation.
Right, this is what the city's projecting, and we feel these are underestimated because we've seen samples up to $7.5 million and close to $1 million a year to operate. So they always underestimate the costs just to keep the public from getting too engaged with it. But this is just a minimal. We could spend $5 million to really apply that to better dental hygiene for our students and children, and better nutrition for them also. That could be easily put together. That's where the solution lies, is better nutrition and better dental hygiene education.
And some of that already going on and has been going on, I understand.
It has been going on in the schools, so there's really, they just need some help. We've got a dental school here in town that could be helping the schools and the community with once a quarter, every 3 or 4 months, having dental hygiene classes and making sure that the kids are up to date. This is very important, this next slide here, because this will show you where water is impacting our bodies. Each one of us has trillions of cells and billions of biochemical reactions going on every second, and these all need safe and healthy, pure, clean water. They don't need to be contaminated with heavy metals and fluorides. Next slide.
We'll get the next slide up there.
And one thing that's very important is that we keep hearing that the chemicals for fluoridation are pharmaceutical grade. There's nothing that could be further from the truth. These are not pharmaceutical grade; they're industrial grade, as we talked about earlier, from the aluminum and the phosphate fertilizer industry, and from the nuclear industry. It's just very, very serious, and they're not inspected by EPA or FDA. They're inspected by the National Sanitation Foundation, which is funded by businesses and grants. So who knows about their objectivity?
Yeah, what grants? Where are the grants coming from?
From different businesses and
So
from the
So
government.
businesses and businesses, then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you can kind of see where the bias may come into that. Next slide. This is one of the early advertisements from Alcoa that was, as we heard from the woman, I think on the slide or on the tape earlier, about the aluminum industry.
Right, right.
And she was talking about the phosphate industry also from the fertilizer. Next slide. This is a good example of one of the solutions, sodium fluoride, that's being used in the west part of Washington County. I don't know if you can see the details, but under the danger poison by ingestion, they talk about the target organs, and they're talking about bones and the nervous system and the gastrointestinal system and the liver and the kidneys, and then the final one is there, it says teeth. But this definitely is a toxin, and with heavy metals along with it. It's just not good.
You know, I hear that the pro group are always saying that, well, it's natural. Yeah, well, so is strychnine. You know, I don't think that natural means anything.
No, that's a real stretch of the description. This is another one, hydrofluorosilicic acid. This is one of them that they intend to be using with the city of Portland. This is extremely acidic, so they'll be adding, in order to keep the pipes from corroding, they'll be adding sodium hydroxide.
Which is an alkaline.
Which is an alkaline.
Yeah.
It's a nice name for Drano. So they'll be adding Drano to it to neutralize the acidic part of the fluoride being added. And there are other utilities like Sacramento that are seeing corrosion of their pipes because of, and heavy costs to replace those because of this one chemical solution, this one chemical mixture. Next. These chemicals that are some of the ones that we've seen identified by the National Sanitation Foundation, these are all heavy metals, and the ones that are starred are what we call endocrine disruptor chemicals. These will impact negatively.
Pretty much all of them.
Exactly. And they negatively affect women and men both. In the prostate for men, and in the they've been linked to breast cancer and uterine cancer and ovarian cancer. So these things will accumulate, and they're very serious.
How about with children?
They're with children too. There's no safe level of these for children. We've got to keep that in mind, because whatever EPA puts for their standards, they're based on adults, not on children. So this is very significant. And it kind of is odd that the pro-fluoride people would say that this is all for the children to benefit their teeth, yet these chemicals that you're seeing there right now have a profoundly negative effect on the children's health as they accumulate over the years. It isn't fair to them.
And they're using studies that are gauging for adults, not for children.
Exactly. And we forget about our pets too. And pets really are left out of the discussion because there aren't very many studies about that. And we know that dogs and cats have difficulty with their bones and with kidneys, and we need to keep that in mind too.
And then some of them are very small, but they still drink a lot of water.
Exactly. And we've seen, there's been an article that I read down, and the elephants in San Diego have had some deaths related to this because of the ingestion of fluoride, taking 60 gallons a day or so. So you might want to Google that, elephants in San Diego and fluoride, and see for yourself.
I'm going to do that when I get home, I think.
And I think that's the best thing I can tell you tonight is that what I'm saying tonight is scientifically supported, but what you need to do as an informed citizen, and I'm not trying to tell you, but it would be helpful for you to do your own research and look up these things that we're talking about tonight. They're very important to be educated in the way you're going to vote, and I hope you vote no. Next slide, please. Okay, one of the things that we see, these are some of the impacts. Again, I said it was a hormone disruptor, which we've seen and has been acknowledged. These chemicals also cross the placenta. So women that are pregnant, you're going to have a buildup of lead and mercury and arsenic in the placenta. They also cross the blood-brain barrier, which can impact negatively the skills of children as they're learning. And again, and I cannot emphasize this enough, there is no safe level of these things, of these heavy metals for children. No safe level. And don't let anybody tell you that there is. There is not. Next slide, please. One of the things we need to keep in mind too is this thing that the precautionary principle. This is a principle that the city of Portland has adopted in 2006, and this is kind of a nutshell what it means. What they're saying is that if we think that there may be a negative public health effect of an action that we take, we're not going to do it. And yet they are doing this, contradicting their own ordinance that they adopted in 2006. Next slide, please.
That sounds like a place to sue them on.
Well, this is very serious, and this is 3 heavy metals that they identified in the text on their executive principle, page 6. This is in their own documentation. This is exactly how it comes out of their text of their executive summary, and this is on page 6 of that whole thing. These chemicals that we see above, the lead, mercury, and arsenic, can cause cancer, birth defects, asthma, developmental disabilities, autism, endometriosis, and infertility. The city acknowledges that they can, yet they're going to electively add these chemicals into our fluoridated drinking water. This is ridiculous.
Are they saying that it's just so dilute that it doesn't make any difference?
It does, yeah, that's apparently what they're thinking, because it doesn't matter what level is coming in there. It's whatever exposure they get for the children, it's going to be negative.
Well, not only that, but they can't control the dosage. A lot of people drink a lot of water. It will be in your coffee. It'll be anything you put water in, cereal.
Exactly.
So it isn't just what water you drink.
No, it's all over the place. And when you take a shower, you'll be inhaling this stuff, and it's just not good. Next slide, please. This is important too, that what we see and what Jim was talking about earlier is that there's a very small portion that we ingest. The rest of it goes down the drain, and we irrigate our gardens. There are a lot of gardens around, especially starting this time of year. When you fluoridate, you're going to be throwing those chemicals into the soil that will be taken up by the plant, and if you have lettuce and leafy vegetables especially, you're going to get these heavy metals in there.
But because they have a lot of water in them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And especially if you have acidic soil, they'll soak it up like a sponge. And so you get 99%, 99.99% of this discharge from fluoridation ending up in the streams and rivers, and then it goes into the food chain there. And we've seen negative effects on the environment from these things. Next slide. And here again is a picture of what we're talking about with the plants and vegetables. Last summer I worked on a community garden in the Cully neighborhood, and the children there were very excited about having this spring, right about now, to do their planting for their vegetables. And if fluoridation comes through, a year from now they'll be fluoridated and drinking this toxic and carcinogenic chemical substance. Next slide. There's my buddy, the salmon. He's not smiling. He
Got
won't
nice
be
teeth though.
He's smiling now because there's no fluoride, but he won't be smiling when the fluoride gets at
He'll
him.
have fluorosis.
Exactly. He'll be in bad shape.
No, we've had he wasn't a microbiologist or a salmon expert, but he had a master's degree in some kind of environmental science, and he talked about the effects on salmon, and it's not negligible at all. Consider 99%, as you say, of the fluoride, of our water, goes through us and past us. It doesn't even go through us; it just goes past us.
Exactly. And this is something we have to keep in mind too. It'll end up in our sewage. And once it's in the sewage, then they have biosolids that they sell back to the community in some areas for soil amendments. So it could end up in getting a double whammy for your gardens with the soil amendments that come through that are contaminated.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Next slide, or is that it?
This is the end of this first part. If there are any questions, maybe we can take some phone calls for right now.
For right now, well, how much time do you have for the second half here?
We have.
I don't know how much time you have.
We have about a half hour. But I don't know how.
We got 26 minutes of the program left here, so you may need all that for the second half.
Let's go to the second half then.
Then we can, if people, any viewers might have questions, we can hold those until we get past the second half. We lost about 10-15 minutes at the beginning of the program getting us technology in line.
That's okay.
We can continue on then.
Yeah, and this is also related. These things are all working together to take us down the road to privatization. And my website is bullrunwaiver.org. We just put it up recently, and we're adding to it all the time. So you'll see some blank spots there, but we're filling those in as quickly as we can. Bullrunwaiver.org. This is what we're asking the city of Portland for, a waiver from this EPA LT2 regulation, because this will stop the spending for the unnecessary treatment plant that we don't need, and for the covering of the reservoirs, because it's just a waste of money. Next slide. This is this is how they compare us. EPA compares us to our pristine Bull Run water compares to the sewage event, and this is a photo of that event in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, over a period of several weeks where there was flooding, and the sewage goes into Lake Michigan, which, as you see on the right-hand side.
On the right side there. Unfortunately, the text is scrambled, but you get a good idea of what you're talking about there.
Next slide. Now, this is really important to our next move as a community. Over the years, we've proven, not just demonstrated, but proven that the science supports our position of a waiver, because we've had no problems from a public health event in our system.
When you say waiver, you mean to get a waiver so we don't have to do what the EPA is telling a lot of cities they have to do because of the gypsosporidium.
Right, and this is exactly right. And science, the EPA now, or last year said science will be our ultimate decision-making thing, and that's exactly what we have. We've already gotten our waiver written based on scientific facts and figures and information. All we need now is the City Council to say, yeah, we'll support you. Right now, the City Council, I testified 2 weeks ago, and they've remained silent since that time. So I don't know what they're thinking. I hope that they get on board with this, because this is the right thing to do. Next slide. Yeah, so this is part of what we're talking about is the chemistry, and the EPA LT2 will add the ultraviolet radiation introduces formaldehyde, and the covered reservoirs allow chemicals like radon that we have coming in from the South Shore well field to come into our homes, businesses, and schools if we don't keep them open. And this is another thing to Google that'll give you some background of what I'm talking about. This is the Regional Transmission and Storage Strategy document that you can find online, written in 2001 by the corporate engineers that, as we have said, want to combine all the different water utilities in the area. That means that we would be drinking blended water from the Willamette, the Columbia, the Clackamas, and Hag Lake. So our Bull Run water would be gone as we know it, and it would be a combination of all these different waters that would be blended up at the Powell Butte Reservoir that's being built right now. And there's another $56 million in the budget for next year to build another pipe across the Willamette River that will be contributing to this whole process. $56 million that we don't need. What a waste of money.
And so what you're saying is a lot of these raising of our water bill is coming from that
Exactly.
project.
Exactly. And the other things that they have set in store for us down the road. They're planning it and they're going along with it. So we need to stop this through the EPA waiver, which is an exemption from the EPA saying that Portland does not have to cover the reservoirs and add treatment for a problem that doesn't exist.
Does the city commissioners and the mayor have to be the ones that apply for this waiver?
Yeah, it has to start there because then we have talked back and forth with our congressional people, and the congressional people say, well, we need guidance from the city council. City council says we need guidance from the congressional people. So as a community, we've been stuck in the middle for the last decade, and that's just ridiculous. We need to get the city council, this new city council that has been educated and know what the situation is. We need to get them on board with the waiver so that we can move on and get the congressional people to go along with us. It's very important. And so this is why part of the actions that we need to take place are letters to the congressional people and the city council.
So the congressional people actually have something to say about it, even though this is a Portland, Oregon issue.
Absolutely. Senator Mercury is on the committee that oversees the EPA budget. He has a lot to say, and we have to depend on him, and we've had conversations with him. I have several times that I would go testify before Congress, and I'm ready to do that because we have such a solid scientific basis for our waiver. We have every reason to not have to deal with this except politics. Next slide. So again, what's the real incentive? Money. And there's a lot of money that's to be made, hundreds of millions of dollars that will translate over time to over $1 billion with debt service. And we're paying a lot of money for the debt right now.
You mean interest, you mean?
Exactly. Interest on the bonds that they've been giving out. Just 2 weeks ago, they put out another $160 million worth of bonds to help pay for the stuff that we don't need and to pay the debt off for the past bonds that were issued. Money to build and design these reservoirs and treatment plant, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, plus an increase of water rates. 5% goes to the City Council and the City of Portland Community Fund.
Not yet.
And so that's the incentive that they have to keep raising rates, is that they get 5% going into the general fund as a utility license fee. Next slide. Okay, so this is just, again, a waivers agreement between EPA and Congress and the City of Portland, and it's all scientifically based. And one of the benefits that we have is that New York City is also asking for a waiver, and that goes back for a year and a half. So we're not out there all alone. We're not out there by ourselves. New York City carries a lot of weight, and if we would join forces with them like we've been asking our elected officials, we would have a very good chance to get this done.
So those are the only two cities, or actually only one city in the whole country then?
Right, but their congressional people got on board very early and have asked for this waiver, and they're legitimate also because there's no problem with their situation either.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide. Again, the Bull Run Reservoir is the one that is really the best one because there's no human entry other than just to manage it. We need to use that as a big part of our waiver.
The closest you can get to it is the Pacific Crest Trail, really.
Exactly.
And that's way up on the hill there.
Yeah, and it is just such a great gift that those people gave to us over 100 years ago. Gravity-fed, sustainable, just a real example of a beautiful, beautiful water system.
Beautiful and visionary.
Yeah. When you look at the history of this, and that would be something to look at too in your spare time, look at the history of the Bull Run, starting with a guy named Isaac William Smith, who was the engineer who designed this thing over late 1890s, and how he did this is just remarkable. With just a pencil and paper and some engineering tools, and that was it. He didn't have the computer, he didn't have anything else, and yet he designed it perfectly and came in on budget. A very bright man.
On budget and on time, I think ahead of time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he built and designed the reservoirs too, to be able to feed the rest of the city. Next slide. Yeah, we've already talked about this, so I guess we can move on. This is the city of Milwaukee from above. This is where this
And that's
flooding.
the Willamette there on the right. Then.
Well, this is the city of Milwaukee, and then this is the slide that we'd seen previously. This is where the Three Rivers.
Oh,
came in.
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin.
Okay.
Right, and then this is where all those rivers came together in a convergence, and down in the lower right-hand corner where the big block is there, that's where the sewage plant is, and that's where it was discharging all that debris into the water right there. The water on your right is the Lake Michigan area, and the winds just blew it south, so they didn't. The water intake is on. There's one on the north end of town and one on the south end of town. So only the people in the south end were getting sick because the wind blew all the debris into their water system, and that's why they didn't respond very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide. That's the same one again.
That looks terrible.
And that is not. Oh yeah, that's pretty nasty stuff. Next slide. Okay, and this is what we're dealing about here. We've talked a little bit about this earlier. EPA. They know about 85 different chemicals that are registered in the United States, yet they only regulate fewer than 100 for drinking water.
That's 180/50th.
Exactly. So they don't regulate very many, and so there's a lot of stuff that we see coming in the Willamette and the Columbia that could be coming into our drinking water that they don't have to tell us about, like formaldehyde. Next slide.
And as it said at the bottom, those are all rated for 150-pound adult.
Exactly, and that's the big concern, because children and pets and the like, they get the short end of it. And I just wanted to bring this up because this is what we're talking about with the numbers of microorganisms. This is just a very tip of the iceberg of what they'd see in a sewage event, yet they only identified one microorganism as the cause, which is ridiculous.
And it's not even listed there.
No, there are just too many of them that are part of it. Next slide. Yeah, we talked about this already. One of the problems that they did too is that EPA says, well, you cannot, for cryptosporidium, you cannot use a frozen sample to identify it because when cryptosporidium freezes, it expands and explodes. Kind of like if you put a can of pop in the freezer, over time it'll expand and then ultimately explode because the water inside of it freezes, and that's what happens.
It expands, it crystallizes, yeah.
Exactly, and that's what happens with cryptosporidium, yet they took frozen samples from the city of Milwaukee and used those frozen samples as the ones that they identified cryptosporidium with, and EPA was very clear in their manual. It says frozen samples must be rejected, yet frozen samples are what they used. That's one of our key points of this whole deal with cryptosporidium, because it doesn't make any sense. This is what we would argue for a waiver.
And Portland is basing a lot of its movement going down that road on what happened in Milwaukee.
Exactly.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah, because there's nothing that's even close to what happened in Milwaukee that could happen here. Next slide. We talked about this too, and it's so important to keep our open reservoirs. Next slide. This is what ultraviolet radiation will do. This is what it looks like. This is a test plant, but it'll generate, as it reacts with surface water, it generates formaldehyde and aldehyde and other things like ozone. So when they say that it doesn't add any chemicals, they can get away with that because none of those are regulated. So if they're not regulated, they don't have to tell you. They're still there, and they're still toxic and carcinogenic, but they don't have to disclose that they're there, which is really really bad. So there are other chemicals that can come through and be generated without us knowing about.
So they're not added; they're actually just generated by the ultraviolet light.
Right. It's the response of the ultraviolet light dealing with organic material that comes through from the water, just natural organic material, and that's what they generate formaldehyde, and then that can start a domino effect of creating other chemicals downstream.
And as you said, if they're covered, then that doesn't allow a lot of it to breathe off.
Exactly. And we'll see that in the open reservoirs that they really respond well to having sunlight. Next. This is I went back to DC almost a year ago and spoke to the EPA and a national audience on the benefits of the open reservoirs, and I was very happy because nobody contradicted me, and there were utilities there that agreed with the benefits of the open reservoirs. And I hope that the EPA continues down the road. Unfortunately, they just got a new administrator in January, so we'll see what happens with that. We've tried to get in communication.
Was that appointed?
Yeah. I forget the guy's name, but Lisa Jackson, who was the other one, was pretty reasonable as far as the administrator goes. So we'll see what happens with this new person. Next slide. These are the benefits of the open reservoirs. Solar disinfection, the natural light, that has a broad spectrum of different light wavelengths that add really good disinfection property. Oxygenation, like we've talked about, the bacteria, break down the unwanted chemicals like the disinfection byproducts from chlorine are broken down 20 times more effectively than they would in a covered reservoir. And it's really important that we have these unwanted gases escape, like we talked about with the radon. And people say, well, we worried about a contamination event in the open reservoirs, but there is technology available now, lasers and other chemical analysis, lasers that will detect microorganisms very quickly and efficiently within seconds, and other chemistry technologies that can allow us for identifying any sort of contaminant from chemicals. Plus we have isolation valves that can be administered very quickly if we find an event that takes place, but that hasn't happened over 100 years, and we determined in 2004 through 4 or 5 months of open reservoir discussion that even a chemical event in the open reservoirs would not be a high-risk situation. And again, we've had no deaths from chemicals or microorganisms in over 100 years. Again, the covered reservoirs cannot say that. Next slide. There we go. That's just a picture of Reservoir 6 and doing a wonderful job of being natural and having that sunlight disinfect it, and with the oxygen reacting with the sunlight, it forms, we all know what hydrogen peroxide is. It's kind of a disinfectant,
Yeah.
and that's, the oxides are generated in that water and then leave naturally and do a disinfection job on helping keeping it safe and healthy, and it helps to keep it tasting good too. The oxygen helps the flavor. Next slide. This is the radon I was talking about. In the red zone there, we see that's the Columbia River. And the red zone below that, that's where we have the radon in the Columbia River South Shore well field.
That's radiation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's nuclear radioactive material. And we have 400, I don't want to get into the chemistry, but we have 400 what they call picocuries in the water. And that is what the level of radioactivity is in that water. EPA says the action level for radioactivity for homes is 4 picocuries. So we have 100 times the amount of radioactivity in the water than we would in a home that would get action levels. That's very scary. That's not what we want. And even though we don't use that Columbia South Shore well field very often, several times a year, all it takes is a covered reservoir to put that radon in there, and that radon will not go away. It will be dispersed throughout your whole home. Next slide. This is the radioactivity we see, and if you look about halfway down in the orange, it starts out as uranium in the Columbia South Shore well field, and then decays down to the orange dot in the middle.
222 there.
Right, radon 222. That's when the gas comes into your home. Well, if the gas of radon gets distributed throughout your home, like upstairs if you've got a shower or something, bathroom up there, or the middle floor, or even the basement, it'll be dispersed through there. But it continues to degrade. Now you're going to say, well, we know people that have radon in their basement, and that's understandable because radon can also come out through the soil. But that radon in the basement can be easily managed, because what they can do to mitigate that is put a vent into your roof and a pipe going up to it, and then it's left out and goes out harmlessly. It's not distributed through your whole house like it would be coming through the water system. And that's a big difference. Radon in your soil that comes up through the basement can be easily removed, and the house can be healthy.
Well, so what you're saying now is the only time we can get radon is when maybe our water filtration system gets plugged because of landslides or something, and so they go to the South Shore and they get the water from there. But what you're saying is they're wanting in this thing on Powell Butte, they're going to be bringing in water from the Willamette, and they're also going to be bringing in water from the
Yes.
from the South Shore.
Yes, absolutely.
So they're going to be, and you say they're going to be mixing all this stuff together. So they're bringing water in from the Willamette. I just want to make sure I got this understood. They're bringing water in from the Willamette. They want to bring water in from the wells on the South Shore, which contain radon, and mix it together. And we'll be using along with the water from the Bull Run, and we'll be using that mixture rather than what we have right now.
Exactly. And that's all outlined in that Regional Transmission and Storage Strategy booklet that I talked about earlier. And that's really something that the audience should look at and Google and get that offline.
What was the name of that again?
Regional Transmission and Storage Strategy. And that's very easy to find. I think it's even on the Water Bureau site now. Next slide.
Yeah, we're down to a little over 6 minutes already, so.
We're moving along.
Yeah, we are now.
There you go in the house. You can see it up at the bathroom up at the top there. The radon would be up in there, and on the next floor with the kitchen, and also down at the basement. Now in the soil application, that stuff is confined to the basement, and with a vent and a fan to remove it, it's gone and it's harmless. But in the water, it'll come through the whole house, and it continues to decay. That's the big thing, because these radioactive particles will attach to dust and debris, and they're not going to leave. They'll continue to decay.
Unless you breathe them in.
Right, and it doesn't take very much to breathe them in. 20,000 people die every year just from radon alone. Lung cancer.
Nationwide or worldwide?
Nationwide.
Nationwide?
Yeah.
It's a big difference.
Yeah. Next slide. This is what a covered reservoir looks like. No sunlight, no venting, but birds can get in there because there are different little holes that they have that allow for the water to keep moving through the system, so there isn't a vacuum, and those birds can then get in through those little areas where the air comes in to allow the water to keep moving. Right above, well, I don't have a pointer here, but right above these are people that you see at the end of the deal there.
Oh, way down there at the far end there.
Those are people. Right above them is a vent that allows air to come in to allow the water to continue to go so it doesn't have a vacuum. But that's where the birds can come in, and there are other areas around the reservoir where they can roost. And if you look up Alamosa, Colorado and Gideon, Missouri, you'll see that they had deaths from covered reservoirs. Next slide. Yeah, we've already talked about this. This is just not a good thing to have. And this is very expensive, and we don't want these toxic gases to come into our homes, businesses, and workplaces. Next slide. And that's the document again, just for your edification, for your information. And what's really important is a decade ago, the City of Portland was one vote away from an intergovernmental agreement to allow for regionalization. And the Portland Utility Review Board stopped it by asking for a review by the Office of Management and Finance. We were one vote away by City Council to turn over our whole Bull Run water system without any comment from the city citizens, and this was a legal way to do it. It's called an IGA. And they can still do it, but politically it'd be very difficult right now for them to do it, but they still can.
But they're doing it incrementally.
They are doing it incrementally, just a little bit at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide. This is what their plan is to add more. We see the Willamette River water down at the bottom. Those two plants, this is the projected sources of water that they want. They are talking about adding over the next few years 2 more intakes of Willamette River water. And then there's one up there on the Tualatin River, which is pretty toxic too. So you've got 3 intakes for Willamette River water, and that will be blended. This is the West Side Blending Center in Hillsboro. And then it'll come over to if you look just east of the downtown Portland, that where the Columbia South Shore comes together with Bull Run, that's Powell Butte. And that's where the west side will blend its water with the east side.
And the blue line on the far right is the Bull Run water coming in.
Exactly.
I see. Yeah, I didn't understand that at first, but that's very clear, yeah.
Yeah, and this will give their, so this is their plan, and they're not making a secret out of it. Next slide. And you see this is upstream from the Willamette River intake right now at Wilsonville, and this is from a paper plant that is housing some of the discharge from the paper mill itself, and then that is subsequently being discharged into the Willamette River. So this is the kind of stuff that we'll be drinking, stuff like dioxin.
I was just going to say, they use dioxins, and that's coming down the Columbia from Canada.
Exactly.
So, you know, we're getting enough of that as it is.
Exactly, and this is what we'll be drinking if the corporations have their way. And the next step is to privatize. Once they get it regionalized with the agreement between the water utilities, then they'll start the privatization process. We've already seen it happen in Wilsonville, which is privatized by a company called Veolia. Next slide, please.
French, isn't it?
Yeah.
Here we're
Yes,
down
it
to
is.
less than 2 minutes here, so.
So we're moving fast. We're almost done. Next slide. After that. So these are the next steps. But before I get to this point, and you can read this as we go along, but privatization is the next step that's going to be taking place once it's regionalized. And it's already happening. We're starting to see Veolia get involved with the agreement now that just took place recently with Tigard and Lake Oswego. Veolia is already in there presenting a contract, and Veolia is working on the Gresham sewage part of their utility, and a couple other places, and I think in Vancouver. So Veolia is working its way into getting a contract. Once these, what they're waiting for, the corporations, is to have the fluoridation in and the reservoirs covered and the treatment plant of ultraviolet radiation. Once that's in, then they're going to make a big push for privatization. And we've seen bad things happen with privatization in Indianapolis, and Veolia got kicked out because they were so poor during the decade of 2001 to 2006.
Well, that gives us about 30 seconds. I hope you were at the end there. Looks like you were pretty close.
We are done, and I can't thank you enough, Jim, for providing this opportunity.
All right. I appreciate you coming on, and this could be a wonky subject, but you make it so it's very understandable, and I thank you very much for coming on. I want to thank the crew as well. I actually want to thank the techs here at the studio. They were able to help us out, get all this stuff up and running, and hopefully we made some sense to you folks out there, and we'll cover this again more in the future.
Thank you, and write the council people and the congressional people. Tell them that you want a waiver. Thank you.